You have heard it described many times. The healed nervous system, the regulated state, the calm body. They speak of it as the destination, as if calm were a place you arrive at. Set your things down and rest. You arrived and something was wrong. The calm came and it did not feel like home. It felt like a room with the wrong air pressure. It felt like the moment before something breaks. You looked around the quiet of your own life, and your body did not believe it. Your shoulders waited, your jaw waited. Some part of you stood near the door, listening for a sound that was not coming. You recognized this. The calm that was supposed to be the reward arrived as a kind of suspicion, and you began, almost without noticing, to do small things to disturb it, to reach for the phone, to reopen the old conversation in your head, to check on someone who did not need checking on. You called this love. You called this responsibility. It was neither. It was your nervous system reaching for the only frequency it had ever been tuned to. This is what no one explained to you. The empath's body, the body that was shaped in a household where the temperature could change without warning, was not trained to live in safety. It was trained to predict danger. Those are not the same skill. They are not even adjacent. A body trained in prediction has built its entire architecture, its sleep, its digestion, its attention, its capacity for pleasure around the assumption that something is about to happen. When something does not happen, that body does not exhale, it tightens. The absence of threat reads inside the muscle and the gut and the small bones of the inner ear as a kind of threat in itself. Jung described the unconscious as having its own logic, its own economy. He observed that what we have lived long enough becomes structural. It is no longer something happening to us, it is something we are made of. The empath who grew up scanning for the mother's mood, for the father's footstep, for the shift in tone that meant the night would be long, did not develop a habit. She developed a self, and that self, that whole self, was organized around vigilance as the price of continued existence. So when calm arrives, it does not arrive as a stranger. It arrives as a contradiction. I once treated a woman who came to me in her early 40s after what she called a successful year. She had ended a marriage that had been quietly destroying her. She had moved into a small apartment alone for the first time in her adult life. She had begun, after long resistance, to sleep through the night. By every external measure, she was free. She sat in my office and described the apartment to me, the light in the morning, the plant on the windowsill, the way the kettle sounded in the empty kitchen. And then she said, very quietly, I am afraid all the time. I do not know what of. There is nothing to be afraid of. I am afraid all the time. She was not relapsing. She was not failing. She was meeting, perhaps for the first time, the body that the marriage had been masking. The marriage had been chaos, and the chaos had been familiar, and the familiarity had functioned as a kind of nervous system anesthesia inside the noise. She had not had to feel the original wiring. Now the noise was gone, and what remained Was the wiring itself, humming in a quiet room with nothing to do. This is the part that almost no one says out loud. For the trauma-formed nervous system, chaos is not painful. In the way safety is painful, chaos is metabolized. The body knows the steps. There is a grim competence inside crisis, the empath at her best, problem-solving, anticipating, absorbing. Safety, by contrast, has no choreography. There is nothing to manage. There is no one to attend to. The vigilance, which was a vocation, becomes an unemployment, and the body, which had organized its dignity around being needed by chaos, now sits in a room where nothing is on fire, and it does not feel rested. It feels obsolete, or rather, more precisely, it feels exposed, because the vigilance was not only a strategy, it was a covering. As long as the system was scanning outward, it did not have to feel inward. As long as there was a household to monitor, a partner to read, a parent to soothe, the empath could remain at a useful distance from her own interior. The other person's storm was the assignment. The assignment was the identity. When the assignment ended, what remained underneath was not peace. What remained was every sensation, every grief, every younger version of herself that the vigilance had been keeping at bay. This is why so many empaths, in the months after they leave the relationship that hurt them, find themselves doing something that confuses everyone around them. They begin to miss it. Not the person they know, the person was harmful. They miss the state. They miss the way their nervous system felt useful. They miss the specific exhaustion that had a shape. The calm of the new life does not have a shape. It is undifferentiated, and undifferentiated stillness to a body that has lived in choreographed crisis registers not as freedom, but as a kind of floating that the system cannot find the floor of. You recognize this? You have stood in your own quiet kitchen, in clothes you chose, in a life no one is contaminating, and you have felt a low and inarticulate dread. You did not have a word for it. You suspected, in the moments you were honest, that you might be doing this wrong, that perhaps people who heal correctly do not feel this way, that perhaps you were broken in some new and more sophisticated direction. You were not. You were meeting the architecture. Jung, in the 2 essays on analytical psychology, returned more than once to the strangeness of what he called the interregnum, the space between an old psychic structure that has collapsed and a new one that has not yet formed. He observed that this space is not, as the popular imagination would have it, a peaceful clearing. It is a vacancy that the psyche reads as menace. The old self had its furniture. The old self knew where to put its hands. The new self has not arrived, and in the room between, the body experiences something that has no name in ordinary language, but has been described in clinical and contemplative literature for centuries as a particular kind of dread that is not about anything. For the empath, this interregnum has a specific texture. It is not only that the old self has dissolved, It is that the old self was, very precisely, a self organized around someone else's weather. Take the weather away, and the self loses its reference point. The empath does not know, in the quiet, what she is for. She knows she is no longer for them. She does not yet know that she is. Simply for herself, and even if she has been told this in 1,000 books, the body has not received the instruction. The body is still waiting for the door to open and the assignment to walk in. So she disturbs the calm. She does it in small ways at first. She rereads the message thread. She drives past the old house. She picks a fight with a new partner, the safe one, because the safe one's steadiness is unbearable. She tells herself she is processing. She is not processing. She is producing the chaos her system requires in order to feel that it is operating correctly. The chaos is the dosage. Without it, the body enters a kind of withdrawal that has, until very recently, gone almost entirely unnamed. This is the territory we are entering, not the symptom, the architecture beneath the symptom, why the body that survived was built in a shape that cannot, without a long and specific reformation, inhabit the very peace it spent its life trying to reach. The peace was never the problem. The body that learned, before it had language, that peace was the lull before the next event. That body is the problem. And by problem, I do not mean fault. I mean structure. I mean the thing that was built well, for the world it was built for, and that has now outlived the world that required it. What you are feeling when the calm feels dangerous is the intelligence of an instrument that was tuned to the wrong room. It is not malfunctioning, it is doing exactly what it was built to do. The question is no longer whether to silence it. The question is whether you can stay in the room long enough for the tuning to change. Most descriptions of nervous system healing stop here. They name the problem, and then they offer the technique, the breath, the grounding, the somatic exercise. These are not wrong. They are simply premature. Before any technique can do its work, something else has to happen. And almost no one names it. The empath has to understand what her vigilance was, protecting her from feeling, because the vigilance was not only a response to the outside world, it was, simultaneously, a defense against the inside. This is the part that the regulation literature, with its emphasis on the autonomic nervous system, tends to skim past. The body of the trauma-formed empath did not only scan for external threat, it scanned outward in order to avoid scanning inward. The hyper-attunement to the other person's emotional state was, at the same time, a way of being too busy to feel her own. As long as she was reading him, she was not reading herself. As long as she was managing his mood, she was not in contact with the much older grief sitting underneath her ribs. The outward orientation was both a survival skill and a sophisticated form of dissociation. It looked like care. Structurally, it was avoidance. The empath was protected from the contents of her own interior by the assignment of attending to someone else's. When the assignment ends, the protection ends with it, and what surfaces is not a clean grief, not a manageable sadness, not the cinematic catharsis that the popular imagination of healing prefers. What surfaces is something far stranger. It is the entire backlog of feeling that the vigilance was deferring, years of it, sometimes decades. The 5-year-old who learned to read the room, the 11-year-old who learned that her own tears made things worse, the 17-year-old who learned to leave her body during the worst nights and come back in the morning to make breakfast. These versions of her did not disappear. They were filed. The filing system was the vigilance. Remove the vigilance, and the files open. This is why calm feels dangerous. The calm is not a neutral state. The calm is the condition under which the filing system is no longer required, and the body, sensing this, does what any organism does when its primary defense is dismantled. It panics, not loudly, not in a way that announces itself as panic. It panics quietly, through restlessness, through low-grade dread, through the sudden inability to enjoy what should be enjoyable. The panic is not about the present. The panic is about what is about to become accessible. I will return to this in a moment, because it matters how this is named. Jung, in his work on what he called the shadow, observed that the materials we have not faced do not remain inert. They wait, they accumulate a kind of pressure, and when the conditions for their emergence are finally present, when the external chaos that occupied us has receded, when the relationship that distracted us has ended, when the silence has finally taken hold, they come up, not because we have invited them, because the room is finally empty enough for them to be heard. The empath who has left her marriage, who has set her boundary, who has begun to live in her own quiet apartment, has not entered the resolution. She has entered the conditions for the emergence of what was always there. And here is the precise difficulty. The shadow material in the empath is rarely what the popular literature suggests. It is not, in most cases, repressed rage at the people who hurt her, though there is some of that, and it surfaces in its time. The deeper material, the material that the vigilance was most carefully containing, is something else. It is the recognition of her own complicity in the architecture, not complicity in the sense of fault, complicity in the sense of participation. She made bargains. She traded her interior for the appearance of safety. She agreed, very young, to a self that could be tolerated by the people whose tolerance she needed. And when the calm finally arrives, what she has to face is not only what was done to her, she has to face the self she became in order to survive what was done to her. And she has to grieve that self, because that self is now obsolete. And the grief for an obsolete self is one of the most disorienting forms of mourning a person can undergo, because the self being mourned is the one doing the mourning. This is the part the body resists. This is what the low dread is announcing. The body knows that the calm has created the conditions for this confrontation, and the body, in its long intelligence, would rather reintroduce chaos than meet it. So it reaches for the phone, so it picks the fight, so it cannot somehow sleep through the night that it could sleep through last week. The system is not failing. The system is protesting. It is asking in the only language it has whether you are sure you want to be this still, because this still means you will see what you have been moving fast enough to outrun. A patient once came to me with this dream. In the 4th month after divorce, she had wanted, prepared for, executed with care. She dreamed she was walking through her childhood home, the house she had not lived in for 30 years, the house she generally did not think about. In the dream, the house was empty of people, but the rooms were furnished exactly as they had been. She walked from the kitchen through the dining room to the small sitting room at the back, and in the sitting room, in the chair her father used to occupy, there was a child. The child was perhaps 6. The child was her. The child was completely still, not crying, not frightened, simply waiting with the absolute patience of something that has been waiting a very long time. The child looked up at her without surprise. The child said, "Very clearly I knew you would come back when there was nothing else to do." And then she woke, and she could not stop shaking for almost an hour, and she could not have explained to anyone why a dream in which nothing bad happened had broken her open in a way that the entire divorce had not. What she had met in that dream was the version of herself who had been left in the chair while the older versions of her went out into the world to manage things. The vigilance had been the older version's work. The child in the chair had been waiting, and the dream was not punishment. The dream was an arrival. The interior had become accessible because the exterior had finally quieted, and the first thing the interior offered her was the precise image of what the vigilance had been outrunning: a small self, perked, patient, never forgotten and never visited. The calm of her new apartment was what had finally made the visit possible, and the calm, for the same reason, was unbearable, because every quiet evening in that apartment was, whether she registered it or not, a continuation of that visit. This is what the regulation literature tends not to say. The dysregulation that returns in the calm is not random. It is the body's intelligent refusal to abandon the parts of itself that were left behind in the rooms where the original wounding occurred. The hypervigilance, the inability to settle, the strange grief in the middle of a peaceful afternoon, these are not malfunctions of the nervous system. They are the nervous system's loyalty to the selves that were stored when storage was the only option. To ask the body to release the vigilance before those selves have been visited is to ask it to abandon them a second time. The body refuses. The body is correct to refuse, so the calm is not, in this phase, an achievement. The calm is a precondition. It is the condition under which the visiting can begin, and the dread that accompanies the calm is the body's accurate sense that the visiting is about to be required. The dread is not a sign that something is wrong. The dread is the antechamber. What Jung understood, and what very few of the contemporary frameworks reproduce, is that integration is not the dissolution of the old structure. It is the assimilation of what the old structure was carrying. The hypervigilant empath does not become a person without hypervigilance. She becomes a person who knows what the hypervigilance was, for she becomes a person who can hear the alarm without obeying it, because she has gone down into the basement and seen what the alarm was guarding, and what was being guarded was never, in the deepest sense, the present moment. What was being guarded was the small self in the chair, the one who had agreed to wait, the one whose patience had become the structural foundation of every adult achievement. The empath who heals at the level of architecture does not learn to feel safe in calm because she has talked her body out of its history. She learns to feel safe in calm because she has stopped abandoning her own interior in order to manage the exterior. The vigilance, once it is no longer required as protection against the inside, becomes available as a different kind of instrument. It becomes discernment. It becomes the precise capacity to know who is safe and who is not, without the obligation to convert that knowledge into a job. It becomes, at last, what it was always trying to be: information rather than identity. But this conversion does not happen because of a technique. It happens because the empath, in the long quiet of the new apartment, stops running from the small self in the chair. She sits in the chair next to her. She does not try to fix her. She does not try to retrieve her. In the sentimental sense, the inner child literature sometimes encourages, she simply stops leaving, and the body, which had organized itself around the assumption that the small self would be permanently abandoned to make the adult life possible, begins very slowly to release the assumption, not because the adult has performed the right ritual, because the adult has finally arrived. This is what is happening. At the level of structure, when the calm feels dangerous, the calm is dangerous because the calm is honest. The calm is the only condition under which the long-deferred visit can take place, and the body that has built its entire competence around deferring the visit will, at first, treat the calm as if it were a threat, because the calm is the end of the deferral, and the end of the deferral means that what was stored is about to be felt. The empath who understands this stops apologizing to herself for the difficulty of the quiet. She stops believing that the dread is a sign that she has not healed. She begins to recognize that the dread is the precise shape of what is about to become available. She does not chase the dread away. She does not perform a breathing exercise in order to override it. She lets it stand in the room with her, the way one lets a long-absent guest stand in the entryway before deciding whether to take her coat, because the dread, when it is allowed to remain, eventually says what it came to say, and what it says is almost always the same thing. It says, there is someone in here you have not visited. The vigilance was the lock. The calm is the key. What is behind the door is yours. There is a moment, somewhere in the second year of this kind of stillness, when the question changes. The empath stops asking why the calm feels dangerous and begins to ask something subtler. She begins to ask what exactly has been doing the feeling, because the dread that arrives in the quiet kitchen is not arbitrary. It has a posture, it has a vocabulary, it has When she pays attention long enough, a recognizable voice, and the voice, when she finally hears it clearly, is not the voice of the present body at all. It is the voice of a much older arrangement. Jung used the word complex to describe these arrangements. He meant something more precise than the popular usage suggests. A complex, for Jung, was not a hang-up or a hangover from childhood. It was an organized constellation inside the psyche, a subpersonality with its own logic, its own emotional charge, its own way of perceiving the world. The complexes were not anomalies, they were the basic furniture of the inner life. Everyone had them. The question was not whether to eliminate them, that was impossible, but whether one could come into a relationship with them that did not require unconscious obedience. For the empath, the relevant complex is one that almost no one names directly. I will call it, for the sake of this lecture, the watchman. The watchman is not a metaphor I have invented. It is the structural arrangement inside the trauma-formed nervous system of the part of the psyche that was assigned, very young, to keep the household legible. The watchman is the one who knew, before anyone said it, that the mother was about to cry. The watchman is the one who calibrated the laughter so that it did not break the wrong silence. The watchman is the one who, while the rest of the child was doing homework or eating dinner or pretending to be a child, was performing the continuous background scan that kept the family system from imploding. The watchman is not an enemy. The watchman is a servant who has been on duty so long he no longer knows how to be off duty. And the dread in the quiet kitchen is not, as the regulation literature would frame it, an autonomic state. It is the watchman's protest. The watchman is registering accurately that he has been given no instructions. The household he was hired to monitor no longer exists. The new household, the empath's new life, the empty apartment, the slow morning does not require his services. And the watchman, who does not know any other kind of employment, interprets the absence of his work as a kind of erasure. He does not believe he can survive obsolescence, so he generates threats. He reads danger into things that are not dangerous. He reaches for old patterns. He insists, in his quiet and ceaseless way, that something must be wrong, because something being wrong is the only condition under which he has a self. Most healing modalities try to fire the watchman. They speak of releasing him, retiring him, dissolving him through breath or movement or repeated reassurance. This is a category error. The watchman cannot be released. He's not a tenant. He's a structural element. To attempt his eviction is to attempt the eviction of a load-bearing wall. The empath who has tried this knows what I am describing. She has done the work. She has done it repeatedly. She has felt the brief opening, and then she has watched the watchman return, not because the work was insufficient, but because the watchman is not the kind of thing that responds to eviction. He responds only to relationship. He responds only to being addressed. He responds only to being given new work that honors the form of his old work without requiring its continuation. This is the part that Jung described in language now nearly a century old as the integration of the complex. He did not mean the dissolution of the complex, he meant the conscious incorporation of what the complex was carrying, such that the complex no longer ran the system from below. The watchman, integrated, does not stop existing. He stops being autonomous. He stops being the one who decides when the body is safe. That decision returns gradually to a wider self, to what Jung called the ego in conscious relationship with the self, and the watchman becomes, instead of the executive, an advisor. He still notices, he still reads the room, but his reading is now information delivered upward, not commands issued downward. The conversion is slow. It does not happen through insight alone. It happens through a particular kind of waiting that almost no one teaches. The empath has to learn to sit with the dread without obeying it and without dismissing it. To obey it would be to return to the old contract. To dismiss it would be to abandon the watchman, which would only intensify his volume. The third option, the integrative option, is to address him, not in the language of self-help, which the watchman registers as condescension, in a language closer to recognition, to say, inside oneself, in something like the way one would speak to an old colleague whose work one has come to understand. I know you are here. I know what you have been doing. I am no longer asking you to do it alone. The dread, when this kind of address becomes consistent, begins to change shape. It does not vanish. It does something stranger. It becomes less personal. It becomes less like a verdict on the present and more like a weather pattern moving through. The empath stops experiencing the dread as evidence that something is wrong with her healing and begins to experience it as evidence that the watchman is still on shift and still uncertain what to do with his hands. The recognition itself is what alters the architecture. The watchman, having been seen, does not have to escalate in order to be acknowledged. He can stand quietly at his post and report what he observes, without converting every observation into an emergency. This is what Jung meant in the very late writing, when he spoke of consciousness not as the dissolution of the unconscious, but as the conscious cohabitation with it. The unconscious did not become smaller, it became known, and the parts of the psyche that had been operating autonomously because they had never been addressed became available for relationship the moment they were addressed. The watchman was not designed for autonomy. He was conscripted into it by the absence of any larger self capable of carrying his function. When that larger self finally consolidates, which is what individuation, properly understood, refers to, the watchman returns to the role he was always meant to occupy. He becomes a faculty. He stops being a sovereign. But the consolidation requires something that the contemporary frameworks tend to underprice. It requires the empath to grieve what the watchman cost her, not in a generalized sense, in a specific sense, to grieve the birthdays she did not actually attend because she was monitoring her father's drinking from across the room, to grieve the friendships she could not deepen because the watchman flagged every intimacy as a potential exposure, to grieve the years in which she was technically present and structurally absent, because the watchman had taken so much of the available attention that there was almost none left for ordinary living. The grief is not optional. The grief is the substance through which the conversion takes place. The watchman cannot be integrated abstractly. He can only be integrated through the conscious mourning of what his service required, and this grief is one of the strangest griefs a person can undertake, because the one being mourned is not dead. The one being mourned is the self that did not get to be lived. The girl who was supposed to be at the birthday and was instead at her post. The young woman who was supposed to fall in love and was instead reading the room. The midlife woman who was supposed to rest and was instead, even in her own bedroom, scanning. None of these selves were extinguished. They were postponed, and the grief is the recognition that the postponement was real, that the years were real, that the loss is not retrievable in the sentimental sense, but that it must be named before it can stop dictating the present. There was a patient of mine, a woman in her late 50s, who came to me long after the active crises of her life had ended. The marriage was over, the parents were dead, the children were grown. By the standards of her culture, she was free. She was not free. She told me in one of our early sessions that she had been waiting her entire life for the moment when she could finally relax. And now the moment had come, and she did not know how. She said this with no self-pity. She said it as a kind of clinical report, and then, after a long pause, she said something I have not forgotten. She said, "I do not know who I would be if I stopped watching. I am afraid she will be no one." The fear was accurate, not in its conclusion, but in its diagnosis. The self she had built was, in very large measure, the watchman in elaborated form, her competence, her precision, her famous reliability, her unusual capacity to anticipate what other people needed. These were not separate from the watchman. These were the watchman professionalized. To imagine herself without the watchman was to imagine herself without the structure that had carried her through every decade of her adult life. And so the question was not whether to release him. The question was whether there was anyone else in there, anyone who had been growing quietly under the watchman's vigilance, who could begin to take up the room he had been holding. There was, there always is. But the discovery of that other self is not a triumphant revelation. It is closer to the long, slow recognition of someone who has been in the house for a while, in another room, whose footsteps one had been hearing without quite registering. The empath who has spent decades organized around the watchman does not, when she begins this work, encounter a new self with fanfare. She encounters, instead, small and almost unnoticeable preferences. The desire to leave a gathering 20 minutes earlier than she would have, the capacity to enjoy a meal without monitoring whether the other people are enjoying theirs, the small startle of realizing she has gone an entire afternoon without scanning for anyone's mood, including her own. These are not breakthroughs, these are the footsteps of someone who is moving very gradually from another room into this one. The other self is not separate from her. The other self is the self that the watchman was holding the door for. The watchman's whole function, properly understood, was to keep the household stable enough that something could grow under the surface. The empath did not know, while it was happening, that anything was growing. She experienced only the watchman, but the watchman was not the totality of the psyche. He was the visible front, and underneath, in conditions that almost no one named, a different kind of self was forming, slower, quieter, less reactive, not built around the household at all, but around something internal that the household could not interrupt because the watchman would not allow the household near enough to interrupt it. The calm, when it finally arrives, is not the empty room that the watchman fears. The calm is the condition under which this other self, this self that has been forming in the protected space behind the watchman's vigilance, can step forward and become visible to the empath herself. The dread in this reading is not only the watchman's protest, it is also the threshold sound of an emergence. Something is coming forward, something the empath has not yet met, and the body, accustomed to a single occupant, registers the arrival of the second occupant as a kind of impossible event, because for most of the empath's life, there has only been the watchman and the small self in the chair, the third presence, the one who has been forming in silence, has been waiting for the conditions under which she could be seen. The conditions are these: the exterior must have quieted enough that the watchman is no longer fully employed. The grief for what the watchman cost must have begun to be felt rather than postponed. The small self in the chair must have begun to be visited rather than abandoned, and only then, in a moment that almost no one anticipates, because almost no one names that this moment exists, the third presence becomes available. She is not the healed empath of the popular imagination. She is something far stranger and far more ordinary. She is the self that grew up underneath the watchman's protection, who does not know what the household required, who has not been organized around anyone else's weather, and who is, for the first time in the empath's life, ready to begin living as if she had not been conscripted. The dread in the quiet kitchen is, among other things, the rustle of her preparing to come into the room. The first time the empath notices her, it is rarely with recognition, it is with confusion. She finds herself making a decision small, almost trivial, without consulting the watchman. She declines an invitation she would once have accepted. She buys the wrong kind of bread because it is the bread she actually wants. She stays in bed an extra 40 minutes on a Saturday, not because she is depressed, not because she is exhausted, but because the body inside the bed is doing something the watchman has no category for. The body is resting, not recovering from anything, not preparing for anything, resting as a state in itself, untethered from the household economy of crisis and repair. And the empath, observing this, has the disorienting experience of not quite knowing who has made the choice. It does not feel like rebellion. It does not feel like progress. It feels, more than anything, like the choice was made by someone who has been there the whole time and is only now being permitted to act. This is a third presence. She does not arrive with a name. She arrives through small acts of preference that the older organization of the psyche cannot quite account for, and the empath, for a long time, does not know how to relate to her. She suspects her, she doubts her, she wonders whether this new agency is a kind of regression, a selfishness, a décompensation, because every reference frame the empath has the watchman's, the household's, the relational history's codes, self-prioritization as evidence of failure. The third presence does not argue with this coding. She simply continues to make her small choices quietly beneath the surface of the older argument, and gradually, over months and sometimes years, the empath stops asking whether her preferences are permitted and begins, instead, to discover what they are, what Jung described in the late chapters of his work on individuation was not a triumphal arrival of the true self. It was something far more careful. He described the gradual displacement of the ego's organizing function by something he called the self-capitalized, deliberately, to distinguish it from the everyday ego. The self, for Jung, was not a personality. It was the larger ordering principle of the psyche, the center that included both the conscious and the unconscious, the watchman and the small self in the chair, and the third presence, and everything else that had been participating in the inner life without coordination. The work of individuation was not to produce a new and improved ego. It was to allow the ego gradually to come into relationship with this larger self, such that the ego stopped trying to manage what it could not see and began to take direction from a center it could only partially understand. For the empath, this displacement is the precise structural shift that the calm requires. The ego, in her case, had been formed in coalition with the watchman. The two had been almost indistinguishable. To be the empath had been to be the one who scanned, to consult. The watchman had been to consult oneself. The displacement that individuation involves is not the suppression of the watchman. It is the gradual recognition that the watchman is not the center, that there is a wider ordering of which the watchman is one faculty, the small self in the chair is another, the third presence is another, and the ego itself is one more, and that the wider ordering is what the body has been waiting to be governed by. The calm, in this reading, is not the absence of activity. The calm is the condition under which the wider ordering becomes audible. The watchman's commands are loud because they are urgent. The self speaks more quietly. It speaks through preference, through fatigue, through the small bodily knowings that the watchman has always overridden in favor of vigilance. To live from the self, in the Jungian sense, is to begin to hear what was always being said underneath the watchman's broadcast, not to silence the watchman, to turn the volume of his channel down so that the other channels become accessible. There is a dream I want to describe because it captures more precisely than any description I could construct what this phase looks like from the inside. I once treated a woman who, in the third year of her work, dreamed she was in a house she did not recognize. The house was hers. She knew this without being told, but she had not been in most of its rooms. She walked down a corridor and opened a door, and behind the door was a small room she had never entered. In the room was a chair, and in the chair was the child she had met in the earlier dream, the small self who had been waiting, but the child was no longer alone. There was a woman with her, seated on the floor beside the chair, doing nothing in particular. The woman was older than the dreamer. The woman was also, somehow, the dreamer. The woman did not look up when the dreamer entered. The woman was not waiting to be acknowledged. The woman was simply, fully, with the child, in a way that required no announcement, and the dreamer understood, in the wordless logic of dreams, that this had been going on for some time. The woman had been visiting the child quietly, without her knowledge. The watchman, who had been guarding the corridor for so long, had not interrupted because the watchman, at some point she could not date, had stopped being the only authority. The visiting had been permitted by someone the dreamer had not yet consciously met. She woke and could not stop weeping for nearly an hour, but the weeping was unlike any she had previously experienced. It was not catharsis, it was not grief, it was the weeping of someone who has just understood that she has not been alone for longer than she had realized, that the abandonment she had been mourning was, in fact, not total, that underneath the watchman's certainty that the child had been forsaken, another part of her had been keeping company with that child for years, in conditions so quiet that the conscious mind had not registered them. The integration was not the production of a new arrangement. It was the disclosure of an arrangement that had been forming all along. This is what almost no one says about the long work of healing the trauma-formed nervous system. The healing does not produce the self that can finally inhabit the calm. The healing reveals that the self has been forming in the protected space behind the vigilance for as long as the vigilance has been operating. The watchman did not only cost her, the watchman also enabled. He held a perimeter inside which something could grow that he himself could not see. And the calm, when it finally arrives, is the condition under which the empath becomes able to see what was growing while she was busy. She does not have to become someone new. She has to recognize and consent to the someone who has been quietly becoming undercover for as long as she has been alive. The dread, by this stage, has changed character. It still arrives, it still pays its visits in the quiet afternoons, but the empath no longer reads it as a verdict on her healing. She reads it as a familiar visitor, the watchman doing his rounds, the old contract briefly stirring. and she has, by this point, developed something like a domestic relationship with the dread. She greets it, she does not chase it away, she does not let it run the house, she allows it to stand in the entryway and then to leave when it is ready, and she returns to whatever she was doing. The body, which had treated the dread as an emergency, has learned that the dread is not, in fact, an emergency. It is the residue of an old employment. The watchman is checking in. He is not in command. What follows is not what the popular literature promises. The empath does not become a person without vigilance. She becomes a person whose vigilance is one faculty among many. The capacity to read a room remains. The capacity to sense danger remains. The capacity to attune to another state remains. But these capacities no longer constitute the totality of herself. They have returned to their proper scale. They are instruments. She is the one who decides whether to use them, when to use them, and at what cost. She is no longer used by them, and this, more than any breathing technique or somatic exercise or regulation protocol, is what allows the body, finally, to inhabit the calm. The body inhabits the calm because the body is no longer being overridden by the watchman's autonomous broadcasts. The body inhabits the calm because the watchman has been incorporated into a larger arrangement that is not itself organized around threat. The body inhabits the calm because there is, at last, someone in the house who can be addressed when the watchman becomes unsure of his role. The dread has somewhere to go. It does not have to escalate, to be heard. It is heard by the larger self, which receives it as information and does not convert it into command. And the body, sensing this, releases the structural alarm that had been the ground state of its existence for as long as it could remember. This is what Jung meant, in the language he had available, when he said that the individuated person is not the one who has resolved the unconscious, but the one who has come into conscious relationship with it. The empath who has done this work does not have a quieter unconscious than she had before. She has a different ratio. The unconscious materials, including the watchman, including the small self in the chair, including the long backlog of postponed feeling, have all become participants, and the calm, which once registered as danger, registers now as the medium through which this participation takes place. The calm is the condition of audibility. The calm is what allows the parts of her to hear each other. She does not arrive at this state in a moment. She arrives at it in increments so small that, looking back, she cannot name the week the change occurred. There is no graduation. There is only, one afternoon, the realization that the dread did not visit today, and then, weeks later, the realization that when it did visit, it left within an hour rather than camping for the night. And then, months later, the recognition that the body inside her clothes is not the body she had been carrying for 40 years. The shoulders are different. The breath is different. The way she enters a room is different. None of this was achieved by deciding to be different. It was permitted by the long, careful work of allowing the parts of herself to come into relationship with each other, with the watchman no longer alone at the gate, and the small self no longer alone in the chair, and the third presence no longer waiting in a room she had not entered. What has been named here is what you have been living. The danger you felt in the calm was not malfunction, it was the precise sound of an architecture being asked to disassemble itself in favor of a wider one. The watchman was not the enemy, the watchman was the servant whose service had become the structure. The dread was not the failure of your healing. The dread was the long postponed conversation between the parts of you that had been separated by the very vigilance that kept you alive. You did not have language for this when you were inside it. You have it now, and what is given in language does not stay only in language. It alters slowly what the body believes it is doing when it stands in a quiet kitchen and feels the old alarm rising. The body, hearing the alarm, now also hears the naming, and the naming is what the body has been waiting all this time to receive. The vigilance has been named, its sovereignty has ended.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.